So here's the deal with this note packet. I know several of you were not here on Friday. That's fine. I hope you had fun, etc. But if you were not here on Friday, if you're not here any this week or any last week, it is your responsibility to get this stuff. Because I'm taking this packet on Friday. I'm going to look through it, and I'm going to give you points based on whether or not you have everything filled out. Of course, if you've lost your packet, you can't have the packet to turn in. So I'm trying to see if you're responsible and conscientious enough as a student to keep all of this stuff, and that you will, on your days absent, get it all in and make it up and so on and so forth. So it all is on Classroom. You can get all of that on Classroom. So remember, you're going to be turning this in. Does anybody need anything from me at this point right now? Okay, so last week we looked at local level progressivism. Lots of terms on Thursday. On Friday, I tried to go over some of those things with you in the video on Jacob Riis. So that's what some of you have missed on class from last Friday, that note page. Now, if you're looking at that video sheet page, you can cross out that huge paragraph question, because that's not due. You don't have to do that if you don't want to, but the rest you should be able to have, and I go over that with you in the video. Okay, now we're on to state level progressivism. Before we get to state level progressivism, does anybody know what holiday is today? Jacob doesn't count because he's already heard this. Yeah. That's in one set of cultures. It's the Day of the Dead, Dia de la Muerta. What about in this country? There are many people celebrating a certain day today, a religious day. Where'd you get that from? The board. Oh, yeah. All Saints Day. Yeah. Today's All Saints Day. It's a Catholic holiday where they look back to the saints who are dead and gone, and they honor them, right? It's also been called All Hallows Day, which means yesterday was the day before All Hallows Day. What do you call the day before a day? Eve. So yesterday was All Hallows Eve. You celebrated it as Halloween. Do you see the connection there? All Hallows Eve, Halloween, right? Comes from the name of it comes from a Catholic holiday. Now, for those of you at home, what we do on All Saints Day, All Saints Day Eve, All Hallows Eve, has nothing to do with the Catholic faith. There's this old Celtic religion called Samhain. Does anybody know anything about Samhain? Do you remember anything about Samhain? Nope. Okay. I wasn't paying attention first period. Tisk, Jacob. It's okay. Celtic. So when I say Celtic, what I mean is like 3,000 years ago, northern France, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, those kind of places. It was also a Day of the Dead. It was a day that they believed that the spirit world and the physical world, the veil and the boundary between them were very thin. And the spirits could walk our land. And so in order to keep them from haunting you and from playing tricks on you, you would wear a mask. Sound familiar? And you would give them treats. Sound familiar? Why do we wear masks and why do we do trick-or-treating? Well, we don't think it has anything to do with those things, and it really doesn't. It's morphed and shifted over the years, right? But that's the origin of those things. Actually, did you know that originally, like in the 1800s in America, trick-or-treating was literally like, give us treats or we'll like throw rocks at your windows? Don't do that at my house. You'll get no, never mind. I won't tell you what will happen. It'll all be legal. Promise. Okay. Let's get into local level progressivism. Look at the very top. I didn't have it for the state level progressivism. I did not have this for local level, but I have it now. The very top, I want to explain to you the goals and the outcomes, the goals and the successes of the progressive movement. Now, we've already looked at the populist movement, and we looked at their goals, and we saw that their outcomes weren't very good for their time period, and a lot of what they wanted, the progressives got. And so we're looking at all these things and more with the progressives. We looked at it at the local level. We're going to the state level now. We're also looking at where they were successful. The progressives were successful where the populists failed. And we looked at 5 different ways to break down progressivism, making people healthy and safe, helping them make right or wrong choices better, reforming the economy, reforming government, and in all areas of life, try to make life more efficient so that there's less waste of time and resources, etc. Another way to look at progressivism is this: were the progressives bringing social justice, freedom, liberation, or were they trying to control society? Well, think of what the settlement house movement was. Remember the settlement house, Jane Addams? It's a place, a big like mansion in the middle of inner city Chicago. And Hull House was a place where if you were an urban poor or an immigrant, you could have health insurance. You could have a place to stay for a little bit if you needed to, daycare for your children, learn English, learn job skills. And doesn't that seem like social justice? They're reaching out and trying to free people from poverty and ignorance and so on and so forth. Doesn't that sound awesome? But at the same time, isn't it a little bit of control too? If you tell an immigrant, here's how to learn English, what are you telling that immigrant about their native language? It's no good here, right? And that might be a practical thing, right? But at the same time, it's kind of controlling of their behavior, right? Get rid of that old language. Take on ours. Get rid of how you were trained to work at your old country. This is how you should do it here in America. There's a little bit of a control aspect there. Now, the settlement house reformers like Jane Addams and Lillian Wald and Janie Porter Barrett didn't just stay at local levels, at the city level. People like Florence Kelley went to the state level. Florence Kelley did something that was very progressive. You see, before her, if you wanted change, what you would do is you would do research into ancient history. And you would look at Aristotle and Cicero and from ancient Greece and Rome. And then you'd look at Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and Montesquieu from the Enlightenment. And you would talk about how their theories apply to today. And that's old stuff, right? And how is that really even relevant? And what she did instead was she went around the state of Illinois and she did research. She looked at factories and she documented and did statistical analysis of how bad things were in the factories for workers, especially women and children. And she presented her findings in this detailed scientific report to the State House, and they were convinced by it. This new way of gathering information, they were convinced by it. We take it for granted today because that's what we do all the time, right? Is gather data. But back then, this was new. And because of all of that statistical research and data reporting, the state of Illinois agreed with her. The State House agreed. The governor signed this bill into law, the Illinois Factory Act. And what the Illinois Factory Act of 1893 said was that women have maximum working hours, and children under the age of 14 are not allowed to work in factories at all. Speaking of social justice, isn't that social justice? Keeping kids out of the sweatshops, isn't that social justice? What about giving women time off? You can only work, I think it was 54 hours max per week if you were a woman. Isn't that liberating? Well, think about it. My wife is pregnant right now. Did you know that? Did you know we're expecting number 4? Did you know? We're expecting number 4. Do I want her working in a factory right now on an assembly line? Do I want her in a forklift? Do I want her carrying heavy stuff? Well, no, that's not good for her health and safety. Do I want my 8-year-old working at the Amazon warehouse? No, because that's not good for his health and safety. Isn't that liberating? Aren't women's bodies less capable of doing the manual labor that men do, and their bodies will break down faster? Isn't that liberating? Now, some of you should be thinking of some exceptions here. Are there anybody who's thinking of some exceptions right now? Yes, Mr. Beaver's butt. Is there an element of social control here too? If a woman wants to work at an Amazon warehouse for more than 54 hours a week, shouldn't she be allowed to? Do you see how there's an element of social control here? And maybe a little bit of sexism, because it's basically saying that women can't do the same jobs as men over time. So what is this? Is this liberating or is this controlling? By the way, if you're wanting my personal opinion, I'm not personally saying that women should not do more than 54 hours of labor. I believe you should be able to do whatever job you want to do, okay, as long as we're clear on that. I'm just thinking about how this was a woman saying this about women back then. I am going to help protect women by limiting their hours of work. And in her mind, this was liberating, but do you see how it might be not as much? Okay, that's that. Now, having said that, this spread. The state of Oregon in the early 1900s wrote a law that said women can only work 10 hours per day, maximum. Women. It didn't say anything about men, just women. And the Supreme Court, because people sue, business owners were suing. They're like, we want women we're going to pay less than men to work more than 10 hours a day because it helps us out. You can't write this law against us. So this law went to the Supreme Court. And I know the Supreme Court's a national level thing, but this was a state level law. And the question is, can the state of Oregon constitutionally limit women's working hours? Louis Brandeis, assisted by Florence Kelly, persuaded the Supreme Court to say yes. The Constitution can allow women in the state of Oregon to lawfully only work 50 hours a week. Florence Kelly and Louis Brandeis both did the same thing that Florence Kelly had done in Illinois. They went around, they did research, they investigated factories, they compiled data, they put it in a report, and they went to the Supreme Court and they argued, instead of going back to like constitutional theory from like 300 years ago, they said, no, this is what's happening now. And they persuaded the Supreme Court to uphold Oregon's 10-hour workday for women. This progressive way of compiling data and giving reports to courts and court cases was called the Brandeis Brief, because of his new and modern way of doing things. And actually, he becomes so effective at this that he gets nominated to the Supreme Court, and he becomes the first Jewish American Supreme Court justice. And it works. And a few years later, Bunting versus Oregon says the same thing for men. Why? Why is this? Because it was the progressive idea that we've got to protect the health and safety of people. And so businesses cannot exploit people by eking their blood, sweat, and tears out of them. Now, what do you think about this? Do you think that that's okay to have a 50-hour maximum work week? You're not allowed to work 51? Man, that'd be nice, because I've surely put in more than 50-hour work weeks lately at school. You may not be able to tell, because my quality of instruction may not be as high as, but I have. Should you be able to work 51 hours if you want? But don't you think that employers will take advantage of you if you are willing to work more? Then why not 52? Why not 60? Why not require you to work 70? So where does the American dream, where's the American dream? Is it letting people work as much as they want, or is it finding a healthy balance so where that your life is not dominated by work and the negative effects it has on your body? That's for you to really decide. Okay, now, women's right to vote. Why in the world in the 1800s would people be against women having the right to vote? What could possibly be the reason? There can't be any good reason for this, right? It has to be hatred of women, right? Do you think every single person back then hated women? Every single man in office or in society hated women that much? Well, probably not, right? Probably not. So could there be good reasons, quote unquote, good reasons? Not actually good reasons, but they tried to argue that this is the reason why women shouldn't vote, and it went beyond just I hate women. Can you think of any? Yeah. Mhm. Right. You had to be a citizen in Athens to vote. And in Athens, women were not allowed to vote because women were not educated. The people of Athens, the founding fathers of our country, said that people who vote should be informed. They should know what's going on. Why should we let an ignorant person vote? And so it wasn't as much about I hate women. It was more about who's educated in society. They should be able to vote. Now, what's the qualifications for voting now? Do you have to take a literacy test in order to vote? Do you have to take if you're born here, do you have to take a citizenship test, a government test to be able to vote? What's the only qualification? You have to be 18. Do you know what amendment that was? Ooh, he's got it. Somebody's in government class. You're going to have to learn those, right? You're going to have to learn those. It was the Vietnam era, and they said, if you're 18 years old and you can die for our country in Vietnam, you should be able to vote too, right? That was the 26th Amendment. Now, don't be fooled. There were many people still in the late 1800s, maybe even a majority of people, maybe even women too, who said, it's not a woman's place to get involved in politics. So that mentality started to be chipped away at during the Progressive era. Suffrage is the right to vote. Suffrage does not mean suffering. If I say women's suffrage, I mean women's right to vote. Okay? Fair enough? The women's rights movement had started in the early and middle 1800s. Now, just so you know, there had been one state during the Revolution that allowed women to vote, and that was New Jersey. The state of New Jersey allowed women the right to vote. It was a very radical idea. They stopped it in 1800. After 1800, no more women voting in New Jersey. And from 1800 till 1869, there was no women legally allowed in the United States to vote. Susan B. Anthony tried in 1872, and she was arrested. You know, the woman that's on the silver dollar, Susan B. Anthony, right? Okay. So, but there was a women's rights movement before the Civil War. But giving former slaves the right to vote took precedence, and a lot of women backed off and said, let's get black men the right to vote first. And then after the Civil War, they started getting the women's right to vote. And so they actually started working at the state level to get it first, not the national level. And in Wyoming in 1869, the territory of Wyoming gave women the right to vote. Now, let's think back to the Northwest Ordinance. Your favorite thing to learn about this whole year. Do you remember, how does a territory become a state? What has to happen for a territory to become a state? Yeah. You have to have a certain number of voters. Exactly. If you make women eligible to vote, you double. Did you hear that? Online people, you double immediately. I'm snapping my fingers. The number of voters you have. You become a state quicker. Western states tended to give women the right to vote sooner. Western territories tended to give women the right to vote sooner so they could become states sooner. And then in 1890, Wyoming becomes the first modern state, because it goes from territory to state, to become a state that allows women to vote. And then slowly, state by state by state, more and more states allow women to vote. Look at this. Look at this right here. See these? These all were territories in the late 1800s, and they had low populations, and allowing women to vote, they become states real quick. Now, I'd like you to also look, see all these dates? These are the states that let women have the right to vote before the National Voting Amendment. Which amendment was that? 19. So even Ohio gave women the right to vote before the amendment forced them to. Now, just looking at the map, in general, what's the biggest region of the country that did not give women the right to vote before the amendment? Yeah. Especially former slave-owning states. In other words, places where there were Jim Crow laws that prevented African Americans from voting. In other words, in the South in the 1800s and early 1900s, who were the only people who could vote? White men. Now, I cannot explain Massachusetts because that's a pretty progressive state. I cannot explain New Jersey or Pennsylvania, especially since New Jersey had given women the right to vote early on. But that's the explanation for over here to get voters, and over here because of racism and sexism. Okay, let's transition then to alcohol. What's the national amendment that bans alcohol? 18th. But it starts out as a local and a state effort. Some of you might be thinking, what is the big deal about alcohol? Some of you might be thinking, look at this. These prohibitionists are taking alcohol and they're dumping it down the sewer drain. And some of you might be thinking, oh my gosh, what a waste of liquid gold. Because for some of you, maybe drinking is not that big of a deal. It's something my parents do, something my grandparents do, something they let me do. So what's the big deal about prohibiting alcohol? Why? Does anybody have any notion, any reason for why drinking alcohol was considered? Why there were people who wanted an amendment against it? Yeah. It's one, right? Any others? This is where we get into control of people. Social control. Help me to keep him, my son, pure. Please vote against the sale of liquors. Well, let's get into it a little bit here. There are two movements going on in the late 1800s at the same time. Temperance said we should try to convince people to voluntarily choose to drink only in moderation. That's a choice that we're trying to persuade people to make. And then there were some who said people won't make that choice. And so we have to take the choice away from them. And that's called prohibition. Totally getting rid of it by law. By law. Okay? Now, here's how it went. Emma Willard. She is the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She establishes this organization that was meant to fight for temperance first, because it's called the Women's Christian Temperance Union. But then it starts to get into the state-by-state battle to help get rid of alcohol by law. And notice here, it's a women's organization. It's supposed to help protect the safety and welfare of women. But it's also a religious thing. Now, it's a Protestant religious thing, not a Catholic religious thing. Because why? Why would Catholics especially not want to get rid of alcohol? Yeah. During what? During communion or during the Eucharist. They take wine and bread. I grew up in a Protestant church that took grape juice in bread. If you have the similar experience, then your church might have been, like mine, affected by the Prohibition movement. Right? But Protestant Christian. Then there was the Anti-Saloon League that was similar to the Women's Christian Temperance Union, but the Anti-Saloon League got more involved in politics and pressuring hardcore for there to be state-by-state laws. And notice what would happen if you were a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And yes, you could be a man who joined it. It just seemed to be more targeted towards helping women. This is the pledge that you would make. And by the way, I mean, our pledge is kind of like, how many of you stood up and said the pledge today? Or at least stood up during the pledge, right? Okay, good. I'm glad you did. I have some in my first period who choose not to, and they're constitutionally allowed to choose to not to, so I don't make a big deal out of it. But when you think the pledge or when you say the pledge, are you really meaning it? Do you really mean, I promise to support the United States and the flag that represents the United States and the United States itself? Is that what's going on in your mind? Like, this is a covenant written in blood. Is that what you think of when you do that? No. When you signed the graduation banner where you said that I commit to graduate by 2024, did you really mean it? Or are you just doing it because everybody else did? That's how most people, I mean, I can tell that there are some people who didn't take the pledge seriously to commit to graduate by 2022, because I can see some of those people on there who have already dropped out. They weren't even trying their freshman year when they signed it, right? This was a different pledge. This meant something. When you signed this card, you kept this membership card with you to remind you that this is what you are devoting your life to. I hereby solemnly promise, God helping me, to abstain, to not partake in, to abstain from all distilled, fermented, and malt liquors, including wine, beer, and cider, and to employ all proper means to discourage the use of and traffic in the same. That was a pledge they made. Oh, this woman is awesome. Her name was Carrie A. Nation. And she, that was her real name, and she took her name seriously. She literally thought that it was her job to carry the nation forward on her back and make us more pure, make us alcohol-free. And she could carry a lot of stuff on her back because she was 6 foot tall, right? She would have been a center on a basketball team, right? She was built like a linebacker, and she carried around with her a hatchet. See the hatchet? Hatchet in one hand, Bible in the other hand. And what she would do is she would go around to local taverns. She would shake her finger under the nose of all the drinkers there. She would intimidate the barkeeper, and then she would take her hatchet and she would smash the bottles of liquor. How awesome is that? And nobody's going to stop her because she's 6 foot tall and she has a hatchet. And she worked for prohibition reform. And even before the Civil War, this idea caught on. The entire state of Maine in 1851 said, we will no longer allow the manufacture or sale or transportation into our state of liquor, of any alcohol whatsoever. It didn't last very long, as you can imagine. But it was called the Neal Dow Law because this early reformer, Neal Dow, got it going. And then after the Civil War ended, this movement picked up steam again. And state by state, town by town, people started asking for their government to outlaw alcohol. Many towns across states decided they would not allow alcohol. They were called dry towns. You know there's still a dry town in our local area? Have you ever been to Laurelville? You know, if you go to a gas station inside the city of Laurelville, there's no alcohol in there because they're not allowed to by law. In fact, the grocery store that does sell alcohol is literally right on the other side of the county line. Young's Food Town. I don't know if you've ever been there. But they sell alcohol because they're on the other side of the line. Like that, this is a legacy of the Prohibition era. Wet Town, of course, was a place that allowed alcohol to be sold. What's so wrong with alcohol? Well, during this time period, there were people who said alcohol doesn't do anything good for society. It's a net negative. It brings more evils than it does good. It brings poverty. And just check out the stats today. You'll see that higher levels of alcohol consumption are associated with higher levels of poverty. I'm not saying it causes it, I'm saying it's associated with it. That drunkenness leads to neglect and abuse. And so this was considered a movement to help protect the health, safety, and welfare of wives and children, because husbands would use their money on alcohol. They would spend time away from their family instead of spending at the taverns. They would come home drunk and beat their wives and children or verbally abuse them. Because let's be honest, not everybody's a happy drunk. Now, some of you might be saying, well, it's just a normal part of life. Well, not for everybody. I mean, I've chosen not to drink alcohol, right? But there were a lot of people who would agree with you. Immigrants thought, you know what? We like to drink. It's a part of our culture. In fact, the word beer comes from the German word Bier. Beer is a part of their society. And there's not a single Irish festival that doesn't have Irish whiskey. And Italians drink wine at their dinner table, right? And so there are a lot of immigrants who thought that this is an American way to control our behavior. And let's not forget that there were big businesses that were involved in this. And political bosses would get kickbacks from them, from this. And so there were a lot of people who said, we want beer. And understand there's a cultural clash over this, but it was popular enough that, which amendment again? Which amendment? 18th Amendment, it was a national law. Now, switching to voting reforms in states, there were a lot of states who said, we want to give less power to big businesses and less power to political machines and more power directly to the people to make laws and to get rid of people who are bad lawmakers. And so there were progressive reforms that tried to make voting and state government more directly related to the people. Let's look at some of these. Initiative is one. Voters can put on state ballots, if you get enough petitions signed, you can put a law on the state ballot. You do not have to wait for a state legislature to write a law that you need, because you know they may not write it anyway. You can put it on the ballot yourself, and if enough people vote for it, then it gets put into law. Referendum is the voter's ability to undo a law that the state house has written. This has happened in your lifetime. Around 2011, the governor of Ohio, John Kasich, and the state legislature wrote in a law that said you're not allowed to have any more teachers unions, police unions, firefighter unions, nurses unions. Any public employee is not allowed to have a union anymore. And the people of Ohio put that law on the ballot, and they rejected it and said, nope, and it got canceled. Recall. You can kick a governor or other elected officials out of office before their term is up, before it's election time. This happened just a few years before you were born in the state of California, where the governor of California, Gray Davis, was recalled by the people of California. And do you know who took his place as governor? Yeah. Arnold who? Schwarzenegger. The Terminator became the Governator. And he was there for about 8 years. And in fact, recently, the people of California tried to recall their current governor over COVID stuff that they didn't like. It failed, but you can do that. Finally, secret ballot. The reason why political bosses can no longer tell who you voted for because of the secret ballot. First started in Australia because it's called the Australian ballot. Now the only thing that they can tell is that you voted, not who you voted for. All of these are political advancements, political reforms made by progressives at the state level. This entire system was called the Oregon system because it was first invented and introduced in Oregon by a guy named William. I don't know if his name is pronounced Uren or Urine. It'd be very unfortunate if it was pronounced urine. Five steps, 5 big paces behind the fire hydrant, please. If you are watching this online, we have a fire drill. Go ahead and get those notes. And then go ahead and get those notes. If you have to pause it, fine, and go back, that's fine. Sorry, I got to get out of here. And goodbye.